right, we are now on to card number 11 or 8, depending on the way you look at it, whether you accept the Golden Dawn's adjustment or not. And that is the Justice or Adjustment card, otherwise known as the Daughter of the Lords of Truth, the Holder of the Balances. Is that what you have?
Sort of. I have Daughter of the Lords of Truth and Ruler of the Balance.
Ruler of the Balances.
And I think the word ruler is kind of cool just in this context because one of the meanings for ma'a is that which is straight.
Right. And just the idea of measurement. I think one of the things that I'd like to talk about even before we go into the esoterics very much is that difference between the titles Justice in the Waite-Smith card and Adjustment in the Thoth card, because they really reflect different worldviews, I think. Don't you?
Yeah, most definitely.
Yeah. I mean, justice, there's something very static about justice. The idea that you submit something to justice and then justice comes up with an answer. It's like, I think of those like the first computers, you feed something in and then you get something eventually.
Right. And she's seated and in the Waite-Smith card, she's seated, whereas she's poised and standing and balanced in front of the throne rather than seated on the throne in the, Crowley Harris card.
Yeah, there's adjustment and she's like on her tiptoes and she's literally just able to sway with the slightest motion. And I've really come to like that idea of adjustment in this card because although justice...
Action and reaction. Constantly flowing.
I mean, justice itself also includes adjustment, the idea that when there is a wrong, it is righted eventually, that there's an equilibrium eventually. The arc of history tends towards justice. But I love this idea in the adjustment card that you're constantly equilibrating, you're constantly making changes, you're constantly tweaking to achieve balance.
And Crowley refers to it as the dance of adjustment. There's a letter that corresponding with Harris about the card where I think he's looking at one of her first drafts of the card and he kind of he's criticizing it and telling her to do it over basically because it didn't convey that motion. It was too static.
And I never used to really understand the Crowley card until noticing that concept of, being so finely balanced on a point was part of it. Because it doesn't express motion until you realize that.
In your card, you have got the idea of balance static, whereas it ought to be dynamic. Nature is not the grocer weighing out a pound of sugar. It is the compensation of complicated rhythms. I should like you to feel that every adjustment was a grand passion. Compensation should be a festival, not a clerk smugly pleased that his accounts are correct. It seems to me that this doctrine is very important as a commentary on the text, existence is pure joy, and I feel sure that the connection of Venus and Saturn with the sign is significant in this respect. The compensation is surely the awakening of the eld of the Allfather, the constant reproduction of the original purity from the last stage of illusion.
Oh, wow. There's so much to unpack in there. And we will do that in this episode. Oh, it's so
And then
big.
he says a few more things, but then it says at his last, sentence of the letter says, I feel sure that when you get the Venus and Saturn dancing motive firmly in your mind, you will produce a lady whom you will like better.
Patronizing, yet brilliant.
Well, I think she was asking for advice on the card, and he was giving his opinion.
Okay, so perhaps go right on in and start talking about Libra then. As you may recall, and we have the diagram on the website, the cards were the Strength and Justice cards, or the Lust and Adjustment cards, were switched in sequence by the Golden Dawn in order to make sure that Leo preceded Libra in the sequence. So we are now arrived at Libra, and we see Libra everywhere. We see the scales, the balances everywhere in both cards. I guess with the Waite-Smith, it's literally right there in Justice's left hand.
Holding the scales.
Right. And then we see this a lot in Crowley actually, where you see a representation of something in the Waite-Smith card. The figure is the something in the Crowley card. Like we saw the Magus was the wand of Mercury. Right. And here we have,
she is the scales of justice. She's the fulcrum of the, of the scales.
Right. that's I think in some ways a key to reading Thoth versus Wade Smith. In Wade Smith, you have a human figure who sort of wields the symbols, but with the Thoth, you go right in there and you are the symbol. You become the symbol. You embody the energy, and that's a fundamental difference between the two, and one reason why people gravitate towards one or the other, perhaps. So Libra. We should talk immediately about what Crowley was saying, because Venus, of course, is the ruler of Libra.
Yes.
And which means that Mars is in detriment in Libra. But Saturn is exalted in Libra, and the sun is in fall.
Right. And if you're not familiar with the terms exalted and rulership and all of those, there is a informational page on our Patreon page for
www.patreon.com/Fortune's Wheelhouse. So the minors associated with Libra are the 2, 3, and 4 of swords. And here we have these ideas of order and justice and adjustment sort of playing through in different ways. And the first one is the moon in Libra, or the Lord of Peace restored, or the Lord of Peace, whichever you like, which is interesting because we're going to also be talking about the Lord of Truce or the Lord of Rest from Strife. So, we have to compare and contrast.
Well, I mean,
those two.
Crowley says of that title, Lord of Peace Restored, as being kind of a mistake because being a 2, it's issued from the ace, so there's no, there has been no previous,
unless you're going from
strife,
from 10 to 1.
Yeah, I suppose, but then you'd come to the... Yeah, he says that peace restored is actually improper, and it should just be peace because there's been nothing to restore from before, There's been no
it makes a
problem
lot more sense
before.
as peace anyway. And, and I think the card expresses that. I mean...
Though I can see why the Golden Dawn might have called it peace restored, just... Not because there was something happening beforehand, but because it's the decan that's ruled by the moon, which has that perpetual, cycle of change associated with it.
I was thinking about that, and I was thinking that, the kind of equilibrium that you get in this card is an equilibrium, the adjustment or Libra flavor of an equilibrium, which depends on flexibility, on waxing and waning, like the moon, right?
Yes.
This card feels to me like such a card of flux, and of adaptability. It reminds me, of course, of the High Priestess because it's associated with the moon, and it looks a bit, in the Rider-Waite version. It has a little bit of that symmetry and color of the High Priestess. I always feel like there is a bit of an ego surrender in this card, It's like...
Right.
You let go of your idea of whatever it was, and I think in the Thoth card you have that lotus.
You see the duality. You see that every idea has its balance and its opposite, and that they're both valid.
Yeah. And that having that perspective allows you to balance.
And leads to peace.
Yeah. Unlike the Lord of Sorrow, Saturn in Libra, and here again is one of those exaltation degrees. So,
I've never thought this card is as bad as
it's not.
It's made out to be. It's actually quite a positive symbol in many ways.
It's a fascinating card. I mean, because Saturn brings us, as the ruler of this face, brings the contractual side of Libra, the sort of like the commitment to justice, the commitment to equality and fairness. Saturn may be many things, but one of them is a boundary setter and a keeper of ultimate justice.
Right. And when I see this card too, I think Saturn, the trance of sorrow that led to the Buddha's enlightenment, seeing that all things are unsatisfactory, if you will, is not very pleasant, and yet it's necessary for the process of enlightenment, Right. It requires a mental adjustment, know.
It is a mental adjustment. And, and there are chains and bindings in this card. It's a card of being tied to things, and that's can be a good thing or a bad thing. And I think that like when you see people, the heartbreak side of it is that sometimes those chains don't work, or it leads to confinement in prison.
Or just that seeing the truth is painful, no matter how necessary.
Unrealize. So when we see the Three of Swords as like a breakup card, it's because you've realized the thing you can't unrealize. But it can also be a card of commitment and saying, this is the thing I know that I can't unknow, and I'm going to cleave to it.
Yeah.
So it was historically actually a card of marriage for that reason, which is you would never think. Looking at the Rider-Waite-Smith, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
But again,
well, unless you were really pessimist about the
the old ball and chain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But we didn't talk about the 4 yet.
No, we haven't talked about the 4, the Jupiter in Libra. So the truce or the rest from strife. That's so fascinating. The idea that there's this moment where in the eye of the storm where everything crazy is going on outside of you. And, you maintain your Libra balance by being in the center of it, at the heart of everything, right? I always point out to people who don't know about it, the pax in the 4 of Swords, which is above, in the Rider-Waite 4 of Swords, above the head of the angel, there's a PAX.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah, so again, there's that connection with peace, even though we call it's a temporary peace, it's the truce or the rest from strife. But I think it's one of the nicer sword cards, right? And that may be the Jupiter effect.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. The Jupiter effect, yeah. The greater benefic.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like
when you think of what the word truce even means, it's an agreement, and it's usually temporary. Like let's pause and see. Let's agree to pause and take stock of what we have here.
Yeah,
like all the 4s are kind of that have that flavor.
There's a moment of stasis, but it's only a moment.
Yep.
Oh, and one other thing that I learned from 36 Faces, Austin Coppock's book, is the goddess Nemesis was associated with this.
Interesting.
Who is, who metes out justice in Greek mythology. She's a righter of wrongs that you pray to when you want revenge. Right. So, so there's this idea that within Libra's justice, you have to have this resting warrior.
Right.
Okay. And, I think there's a couple of things that are worth pointing out. Well, first of all,
a couple hundred things.
Oh my God, there's so much.
There's a lot in this card.
I'm having so much trouble knowing where to start here because there's so much.
Yeah, why don't we start with looking for, references in either card and kind of just let it evolve from there somehow.
Okay.
Because there's so much here, I don't know where to begin either.
Yeah.
One of the things in the Thoth card, the Venus-Saturn relationship is said to kind of personify the phrase, love is the law, love under will. Mm-hmm. So where every action or every energy must be directed with integrity.
That, of course, is the central tenet of Thelema, the belief system that was originated by Crowley.
He says of this card, nature is not just, but nature is exact. And he means that it's not a moral or ethical, like in the Waite-Smith card, it's more of like a justice as a judicial figure judging, and this is more of the laws of nature kind of thing.
Yeah, as we find nature adjusting herself when we do anything outside, or in the case of, climate change or whatever it is that happens, there's an equilibrium that nature seeks.
And then the Saturn influence, where Saturn is the exaltation of Libra, Saturn is karma. Well, you could imply a moralistic reading of the word karma. It really isn't exactly that. It's more of a cause and effect that's beyond judgment.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to think of Saturn in Libra in terms of the 3 of Swords, because it's a card I've really evolved with over time. I think, although many people see it as a card of heartbreak, or just because of the Rider-Waite-Smith image and, well, the Thoth image as well, but there is a severity about it, but there's also I think of it as the realization you can't unrealize, the commitment you cannot undo. That's that Saturnine longevity that goes with it and applied to Libra.
Right. The long view. There's a lot of sorrow involved with the loss of attachment.
That's true. And that's why, we have the sword of justice. The sword of justice both allows you to perceive and cuts away that which is no longer useful in a way that can be painful.
Yeah, and the sword is present in both of these cards. So maybe that's a really interesting
should talk about the
symbol we can talk about. So.
Yeah, let's do that. So
you want to start, or I want me to start?
Well, I mean,
there's a lot to say.
There's not too much to say about the one in the Wade Smith card. It's a sword, right? Although
it's pointing to the path.
It's pointing to the path. That's oh gosh. So in the Wade Smith card, I guess we'll jump right in with the Kabbalah here, because the Wade Smith card, you can see in the gesture of the sitting justice figure that the sword reaches up and to the left, and the scales dangle down and to the right. And if you look on the Tree of Life, which you can do on our website where we have the diagram up, you can see that the path of justice or adjustment runs between Gevurah and Tiferet, which means that it runs from that upper left to lower right direction. And you can, if you place the card on there, you can actually see that very clearly, as if justice is gesturing up with the sword to Gevurah, which
the sword of severity.
The sword of severity, the Sephira of Mars, the god of the sword. And then the balances dangle down towards Tiferet, the Sephira of the sun, of harmony, of balance. Mm-hmm. So there's a real, there's a real exact kind of visual allusion to both of them in the card.
So what do you think about the 1 foot peeking out? I was thinking about it just because why 1 foot? Why did they just show one? And I was thinking maybe that foot is pointing to Hod. I don't know.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I can see that. And it's such a, and the Justice card is, in Wade Smith particularly, is such a card of the mind. It's so...
a card of clarity. The sword is actually the weapon of discernment. So that, it's a lot about reason. It's the weapon of reason and the mind and discrimination and that facility of deciding.
Power of the intellect to solve the problem. Also, we have, that's a white foot, white in Wade Smith, so often representing the purity of intention, which we see in this card as the application of principle to real life. But the sword in adjustment in the Thoth card has its own story, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's actually, if you have your deck and you get out your Ace of Swords, we could probably put a picture of it up too when we get there on the web, but it's the same sword as in the Ace of Sword, and there's also a description of this sword. Crowley refers to it as the sword of the magician or the sword of the magus. And there's an interesting description in his Magic Book 4 where he describes the magical weapons that if you read it, it kind of looks just like this. And you can tell that's exactly what is depicted here. So I have the place marked to equilibrate with the hilt. For steel is the metal of Mars as copper is of Venus. Those 2 planets are male and female, and thus reflect the wand and the cup, though in a much lower sense. The hilt is of Venus, for love is the motive of this ruthless analysis. If this were not so, the sword would be a black magical weapon. The pommel of the sword is in Da'at, the guard extends to Hesed and Gabora, the point is in Malkuth. Some magi make the 3 spheres of lead, tin, and gold respectively. The moons are silver, and the grip contains quicksilver, thus making the sword symbolic of the 7 planets. But this is a fantasy and affectation.
So wait, the point is in Malkut. Is that, I believe you said, right?
Yes.
So that's interesting. It's almost...
on this card.
Oh, I see. Okay, on the adjustment card, the point is in Malkut. Got you. Right, and it is a very exact description.
So there's a little tree of life embodied in the sword itself.
As so often is the case in those Thoth images. And it's interesting because, the hilt is of copper. You don't see, it's not orange copper, it's oxidized copper, green copper, I guess, because that's what we see.
Copper of Venus.
The copper of Venus.
Here's another, what he says right after this, he says, Whoso taketh the sword shall perish by the sword is not a mystical threat, but a mystical promise. It is our own complexity that must be destroyed.
Interesting. It's worth mentioning that on the Ace of Swords, we have inscribed the word thelema, of course, which is literally the thing wished for in Greek from the verb thelo, which also translates as will, which is a fundamental principle in...
It can be a verb or a noun, will.
So it's interesting to see that the sword of will is front and center in the adjustment card.
If we think of the sword in terms of alchemy, then you have, again, the separation that we also saw kind of in the Lover's card, where the 2 figures are also associated with that. And interestingly enough, their letter is Zayin, which means sword. So you have the sword imagery in both of these air cards.
You do. And, and the lovers is an interesting theme to think about because Libra, of course, is the sign of relationship. And there are relationships implied in this card throughout. There's a relationship between Venus and Saturn, and there's the relationship between the Justice and the Fool, which we can also talk about. But since we're talking about Venus and Saturn, let's continue with that for the moment.
When I think of Venus and Saturn, I also think of Babylon. We normally think of her as the lust card, but Venus-Saturn is kind of perfect for the daughter becoming the mother, returning to Binah and home
so
of Babylon.
The way that the daughter returning to the mother, we should probably talk about the way the court cards work in Thoth a little bit. The way the idea is that there's the king and the queen and the prince and the princess, the king in Chokmah, the queen in Binah, the prince in Tiferet, and the princess in Malkut. And the idea is that the princess rises to meet the prince in Tiferet. They, in turn, become the queen and king, again, as, in this sort of recurring family dynamic. When the prince becomes the king, he falls asleep, is the fairy tale. The princess has the task of wakening the king. So
once she's the queen.
So there's this, identity between the princess and the queen, and the idea that, this Venus figure must awaken the old king in order for the cycle to renew. She's not just obviously awakening him, he's impregnating her as well. So the cycle can begin again.
And Crowley actually refers to this process because he says that this card is the final hay of the divine name, becoming the primal hay of the divine name. So the daughter becoming the mother, and then cutting the attachments, is part of the process wherein she awakens the eld of the All-Father, or you can say the Yod of the four letters. So you have the Yod, He, Vav, He in order, the father, mother, son, daughter. And in effect, when you think about Yod, we've already talked about that card in the Hermit. So I kind of think it's a case where awakening the eld of the All-Father, she's waking up that Yod figure and turning the Hermit back to a fool. So we talked about the fool progressing to the Hermit, from the initial point and then to the Yod. So there's a connection, a progression there. And I kind of wonder if there's also a connection here with that symbolism. And so then you have the connection, if you consider that, awakening the All-Father is referring to the Yod of the divine name. That's also a connection to Keter, right? So, and there's a lot of that symbolism in this card because the letter itself is the ox goad. That fool's letter is ox. So it goes the ox, or as I like to say, it gooses the yod. Gooses the yod. Because the fool is formless and lacks any direction whatsoever. He needs that prodding into the adjustment. The constant adjustment kind of guides him on his way through his path of becoming mature as the hermit, and then the cycle begins again. So there's a lot of that
dance between the fool and justice. And it's also interesting to think about when you consider that the fool is air and justice is Libra, an air sign, which is like the music that shapes the sound waves into something that is beautiful and rational.
Yep.
And also, when you think about it, if you look at the tree, right, going back to Venus and Saturn, if you consider that the Sephira of Venus is Netzach on the pillar of force down on the right, and Binah is associated with the number 3 up in the upper left, how would you get from Netzach to Binah? Well, you could go through Tiferet, through Gevurah to Binah, which would take you straight through the path of justice or adjustment. One way. There's probably many other ways you could do it, but that's one of the most direct ways you could do it.
When I think of Venus-Saturn, too, I also think of the mother-daughter symbolism. So Saturn being the universe card, which is the daughter, the maiden, and then Venus being the empress card, the mother, the fertile mother. So again, you have more of that daughter-mother symbolism.
That's true.
And Crowley also calls the card the woman satisfied. Of course he does.
Of course he does.
But that's also about that process of the daughter
becoming the mother.
Becoming the mother. There needs to be some satisfaction first.
There has to be some satisfaction involved.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I took Zoe to see Wonder Woman this weekend, and it was pretty great, by the way. And there's a wonderful line that Wonder Woman says to her traveling companion, the captain, who is the first man she's ever met. They're sleeping on a boat, and she says, "Why can't you?" He makes his bunk over on the other side of the boat, and she's like, "Why can't you sleep with me?" And he's like, "Well, it's not polite. It's considered rude." And they get into this discussion of whether she knows about sex. And she says, "I know all about that. We've read about reproductive biology, but our conclusion was that the man is essential for procreation, but for pleasure, unnecessary."
Well, I think that might have something to do why Crowley put this card back to card 8, because the woman satisfied comes before the hermit.
Oh man, this is
Sorry.
a family podcast.
You can delete
I'm leaving
that.
it in. Then. I'm leaving it in. So we have in the card we have this wonderful diamond pattern at the top, which is a
Keter reference.
Yes, but also Harlequin, the dancing partner of the fool,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
Right. And the diamonds are Keter-esque. And that idea that they are counterparts, the idea that she's taking the raw energy of the fool and shaping it into pattern.
Somewhere that kind of resonates with something I read about that diamond as being, it's like a Vesica Pisces. It's a portal, and it's the portal through which the adjusted experience passes on to the next manifestation. And it's part of that never stopping dance. Experience happens, there's an adjustment, every action has a reaction, and then it becomes a new manifestation, which then has another effect. And
right.
It's also kind of brings in Saturn again, because all of these adjustments could only take place if there was the realm of time.
The realm of time occurs only in time. Right. Yeah.
So all actions and reactions take place in time.
And that's something I love about your card, which I hope you'll put up on the site too, that adjustment is deeply tied to music, which ties into this idea of time and the dance and the shaping of the airwaves and all of these terrific motifs that are just beneath the surface of the card. Also, air, feather. We see that in the Fool and in this.
The feather. She's got the two feathers on her headdress with that. It looks like. Is it a Urias? How do you say that? Is it a Urias serpent?
I believe it is.
And then there's the little round ball in between the two feathers that makes it looks to me like a winged globe, like a winged disc, which is another Aleph reference, another Fool reference.
Right. And so we have the feather on the Fool and that he wears on his hat, or in the Waite-Smith card. And in the Thoth, it's also there.
Well, in the Thoth, there's the wing of Ma'ut, the vulture wing, and these could be considered, the plumes of the vulture goddess as well.
They could be, as well as the feather headdress of Ma'at, the goddess of justice.
I think they're really, those two goddesses have some parallels, perhaps.
Yeah. I also think it's interesting that we have a blindfold or a mask on this justice figure, who is like both as her part of her Harlequin costume in the dance, but also because of blind justice, which is not something we see.
I think I read it's supposed to be a mask, though, rather than a blindfold, but still it may be a veil of sorts.
Yeah, but it's interesting to think about because, we often see the justice figure with a blindfold, though we don't in the Waite-Smith. But if we did, imagine that if you've ever, danced. I spent a lot of years doing partner dancing, ballroom dancing, and you, as the following partner, you listen and you can close your eyes, you listen and you feel, and you just feel your way through the music. And, there's an intuitive quality to this version of adjustment where she's concentrating. She's not using her eyes exactly. She's concentrating. The chains are connected to her thoughts. The chains of
I think
justice.
Crowley calls them the chains of cause.
The chains of cause. So on the slightest, change of thought or, the balance, the shifting of the weight within the scales, it's connected through these chains to her mind in a way that's very subtle and very finely calibrated.
The chains are balanced on those feathers. When you mention the feather, It also made me think of, we talked about in the Fool, the feather being a symbol of air. Well, it's interesting in Egyptian hieroglyphs, the feather was used often as an ideogram in words that have to do with both air and with emptiness. And again, that makes me think of the Fool.
And
The card of air and the zero of nothingness, of emptiness. So that's it's kind of interesting. The letter for this card, Lamed, meaning ox goad, though, the simple letter meaning is work. So all of this adjustment, it's not easy. It takes, I think it means it takes some effort, some discernment.
Right. I love that parallel of the ox goad of Lamed and the ox of Aleph, again, reflecting that relationship of justice telling the fool what to do.
There's such a deep truth there. If you really dig into Crowley's writings on the topic, there's a real lot there. One of the things he says about this card is that it's beyond all planetary and zodiacal considerations. So what he's trying to say there, I think, when you think of what is beyond all planetary and zodiacal considerations, on the Tree of Life, that's only Keter. So it's back to the awakening of the All-Father process kind of thing, back to the Fool, back to Keter, that connection there. Because, on the Tree of Life, if you look, every of the Sephiroth is associated with a planet except for Hakma, which is the zodiac. So what's beyond all the planetary and zodiacal considerations?
Right.
Only
Keter.
Only Keter.
Right. Only the
so
crown.
Back to the Fool, back to the eld of the All-Father, if you will.
Which makes sense, since it's the final process of Hay that
and
takes you back
even
to
the
origin.
Aleph Lamed being the name of the Book of the Law and being the name of God, and it's also one of the God names of the of Hesed as well.
Right. And there are Hesed references throughout there because there are fours of
There's
spheres.
a lot of fours here, yeah. The 4 spheres in the corner, the 4 on the top and bottom of her throne.
And even in the weight card, there's a square on the crown.
There's a square with a circle in it.
And the pin of the cloak or whatever it is.
Right, the pin of the cloak. Is that the circle squared, perhaps?
It
a
could
reference
be.
to the circle
It could
squared,
be.
maybe?
Yeah. Now, there's another... There's a reference I was trying to get to the bottom of. I spent like 2 hours the other night trying to reading through Golden Dawn initiatory rituals. 2 hours I will never get back. And because I saw a reference in The Secret Language of Tarot, Wald Amberstone's book, to the idea that there is this rite that you do as a Golden Dawn initiate, where you go into the Hall of Two Truths. Two truths. And you must
feathers.
Go before the altar. They have these altar diagrams. They have, they set each sort of little initiation up as a piece of theater, and there's an altar. And above the altar is the scales of justice. And the pillars you stand before. You have as part of your ordeal or your ritual, you have to name everything on the pillars.
I've read that.
Yeah. And it's basically a reenactment of what the soul goes through at the time of death, I think.
So is that a parallel to in the Hall of Truth or Two Truths, the process wherein the soul has to recite everything that it has or hasn't done wrong?
I think so. Against the feather.
I have not cheated the grocer.
But yeah, the idea is that, you're in this Hall of Two Truths where you have to have an accounting, and the pillars are blank because they don't give you the answers, is the idea, as opposed to the Boaz and Yakin pillars of the High Priestess, which are marked and black and white. These are a blank slate.
So more about the path, Geborah and Tifereth, the whole severity and beauty thing. I think that's an important balance because, when I think of Geborah, there's a phrase that I always think of that says, "Let justice be done, though the heavens may fall." And that's a bit harsh, right? I mean, you need that balance, that beauty and harmony, that kind of influence that love has to be underlying these adjustments, and it can't all just be the severity.
Yeah, even though justice is cloaked in red in the Waite-Smith card, the color of severity, the color of Gevorah. What's interesting to think about for a second is something that you like to do, which is look at the symmetry on the tree where the hermit
Well, this is a tough one
reflected.
because where do you look at? Because do you look at the ones that go like this or the ones that go like this? Like, did I write down some notes?
So if you're
No, I
reflecting
didn't.
across the middle pillar, then it would be the hermit, and if
Right.
you're reflecting across Tiferet,
Yep.
across the horizontal,
There's so many
axis.
paths coming out of Tiferet. It's
Yeah.
like there's a lot you could do the one below it, you could do
You
the one
could.
diagonal from
You
it, or the
could.
one mirror image of it.
So you could make an argument for justice paired with death. You could make an argument for justice paired with the devil. You could make an argument for justice paired with the hermit.
Well, I see a definite connection to the Justice and Hermit story with the whole the Yod, back to the Yod and Keter and that whole story that we were talking
Yeah.
about. So that's definitely there.
And also the connection, well, there's the Virgo Libra, right next to each other. Perhaps there are two ways of approaching Tiferet, from the pillar of force and the pillar of form, from the side of shaping it and the side of releasing. I don't know. I'm trying to sort of make sense of that in my mind, the fertility of the hermit versus the sort of
Well, there's a fertility in this card too, if you
yeah, there
consider
is,
the
yeah.
mother to daughter,
right.
daughter to mother. I mean, the daughter to mother, woman satisfied aspect.
Well, there's sort of like what's interesting, one way to look at it is that there's a sort of a paternal generation from the hermit in the sperm,
Right.
carrying
right.
from father to son, from, chesed, on the chesed side of the tree, whereas this is on the bina side of the tree, and you have the mother to daughter,
Right.
passing on,
Yeah.
passing up through the tree.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I kind of see. I guess if I had to pick one to be the opposite side, it would be that mirror image of the hermit in this card to reflect on. Although I suppose if you thought long enough on the other ones, you could probably come up
You
with
could
a few
probably
connections.
come up with some connections, right. But listeners, if you would like to submit your thoughts on the parallels between Justice Adjustment and the Hermit, that would be interesting. We'd love to hear them.
You ever read the book of Thoth and Crowley's writing on this card? He just has a lot of cool things to say. He says something like, all things are beauty and all are truth because they cancel each other out. It's kind of speaking of that sort of separation, dividing things into, for everything in the world, there's its contradiction and its opposite, and that that's part of...
That could be part of that diamond pattern at the top, the white and the black.
Right. And he says something like, about her facial expression, he says her secret satisfaction in her domination of all the forces of disequilibrium in the universe, or something like that.
Oh, Uncle Al.
I would have loved to have a beer with him, or 3.
At least. Or, some kind of mind-altering substance. I think he probably would have been game for just about anything. Let's not forget the alpha and omega in the scale.
Right, the alpha and the omega. There's another Fool and Universe reference.
Right,
So, yeah, so there's the Universe as the daughter and the Fool as the Keter and Aleph and the Aleph Lamed, all that whole cycle of everything.
Right.
That's cool.
Right, it is cool. And it's interesting because although we tend to focus on, the path between the Sephirot when we look at these cards, this one really encompasses the whole tree. It
Yeah.
really goes from top to bottom. I'm sure it sounds like every time we talk about a card, this is the special one.
Yeah, well, there's repeating motifs for sure. I mean, a lot of them are about this process of, I guess you'd call it enlightenment, the whole climbing of the tree or descending, or that whole cycle of becoming and absorbing different parts of the tree. It's expressed over and over again in different ways on each card. So there's definitely some repeating symbolism and some repeating stories. They just shows different ways of saying kind of the same thing.
Right.
Different facets of the same gem, if you will.
It is. I mean, I think it's important to remember that every card encompasses the whole. You can get to the entire journey through any one card.
Right.
At any given moment.
That's kind of the meaning of the Fool.
Right.
The Fool has everything potential, is thus connected to every card, and there's that's my deck. I kind of referred to that as wormholes. They're everywhere throughout the world and throughout the tarot itself, and because everything is connected in some way to everything else. if you want more phallic references, there's Crowley.
You can never have enough.
You can never have too much.
I also want to just say something about Venus and Mars real quick.
Yes.
Just because, right? Because we, even though Mars is in detriment in Libra, even though Venus is the ruler of Libra, they are united in this card, as we see in the sword.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. There's definitely the woman satisfied, Venus and Mars.
Right.
So if you need more phallic symbolism, in Crowley's description in the Book of Thoth, he talks about the judex and testes.
Oh, yes, the judex and testes.
The witnesses and the judge. Well, someone had to say it.
Someone had to say it.
So more obvious, I guess, which is also visibly depicted in the card if you look at it in a certain way with the two spheres and the sword.
Yeah, and the idea that the testes are, carry on the information from one generation to the next is encoded in there too, I think.
There's not in the Book of Thoth, but in his writings, The Vision and the Voice on the Aethers, the seventh Aether, which the seventh sign is Libra. So there's a description that actually talks about Venus in Libra and Saturn in Libra. And it says, yet remember that in every one there goeth forth a witness and justice of the Most High. Is not Libra the house of Venus? And there goeth forth a sickle that shall reap every flower. Is not Saturn exalted in Libra? Daleth Lamed Tau. So there's a lot to look at there. So he's saying... Oh,
yeah. Daleth, Venus, Lamed, Justice, Tau, World.
That's more daughter and mother. The daughter is on the universe card, the Tau. The Daleth is the Empress card, the mother. And in between them is Lamed, adjustment.
So you've just spelled Dalet.
Yes, exactly, the mother. And he also mentions here, there goeth forth a witness and justice of the Most High being a Keter reference. And then he specifically mentions the house of, Venus and Libra, and then he mentions Saturn exalted in Libra and the sickle that reapeth every flower. So that's the sickle being a traditional...
Of Saturn.
Yeah, symbol of Saturn. So I thought all that was really cool, seeing as that's the seventh Aether and Libra is the seventh sign, and it specifically seems to be referring to this card. It also in that same, later on or earlier on in that verse, it mentions her being on the throne of turquoise and lapis and is like a flawless emerald.
So that brings us on the throne of Hesed or Jupiter and is like Venus.
Right, and those are all the colors of this card too. You notice that it's all blue. It's all blues and greens.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really cool.
And just sort of going back through some of the goddess figures that are associated with it. One thing I noticed was that the goddess Themis, the Titaness, was associated with justice as well. And she's the personification of order. Her children are the Hore, the hours. Again, that idea of time broken
Saturn,
up,
right.
and ruling and regulating and giving structure to the universe. Athena as well. We talked about DK, which is... she's another justice figure in the Greek mythology, and Nemesis. So, we have the severity of Nemesis and the fairness and balance of
Themis.
Right.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay. So as far as color goes, we talked about emerald, green, blue.
So emerald, the king scale, and then you have a blue and a blue-green in the middle there, and then the princess scale is that more pale version of emerald, the pale green or light green.
And plum, too, don't we have? Or maybe not.
I don't think plum is in
I may
here.
have read that somewhere wrong.
Well, there is a plum in the card for the Rider-Waite card, that veil.
Yeah.
We didn't talk about the veil. And,
the veil.
There's the veil between the pillars, and it's that violet card. And I wasn't sure. I was trying to figure out, why a violet veil. Is the violet Jupiter, a Hesed reference, or is it Mercury? It could be Isod, all the things that are violet.
Right. And the veil, is it like the priestess's veil?
Yeah.
That's a good question, too.
Right.
I mean, the idea that...
It's a veil between the pillars. So
it's a veil between the pillars. It's certainly suggestive of that. But, I think of justice as being, I always interpreted that veil as being part of the very cerebral kind of nature of the Waitsmith card. The idea that you set apart this matter on a stage so that you're not influenced by outside matters. You create this artificial environment where you can be objective and not be influenced by the outside
blind
world.
justice, even though she has her eyes open.
Right. It's not an esoteric reference, but that's, one of the ways I've seen it. Whereas I think of the veil of the priestess as something that separates worlds, but also is a doorway between them.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know what you mean.
And whereas this is, her veil is covered with the tree of life, and it's a portal. This is kind of a separation.
Right, it's another
it's another barrier.
Portal. Yeah.
Yeah.
Both cards have a portal of sorts.
Anyway, so we were talking about color, green, as you were saying.
One thing about the scales, if you notice both cards have the scales, so that's obvious Libra symbolism, balance. Balancing each thought with its exact opposite. But it's also, look how they're bubbles of air.
Yeah, bubbles,
It looks like there's tons of these bubbles of air in that card. So
right, air.
Air could be another Fool reference, or just
or
the
air
fact that
sign of
Libra
Libra
is an air sign as well.
That's right, yeah.
And those scales, actually, with the alpha and omega, and within that diamond shape, there's a OTO Laman. That's a Vesica Pisces shape. It's not quite a diamond. Within it are those two scales with the alpha and the omega, and they're balanced on the tip of a sword, and above it is a crown. I'm thinking, right there, alpha, omega, scales, sword, crown of Keter.
Right.
Within the Vesica Pisces, which is
it's all there.
Just a rounded diamond. Interesting.
And a yoni reference.
Of course
well,
it is.
We're at it. Of course it is. So the green of Venus we can find throughout at least throughout the Thoth card. There's some greenishness. Oh yes, there's green in the vestments of justice on the Waitsmith card as well. Yeah, there's sort of
greenish.
Yeah, kind of greenish. And green we associate with Venus and
blue,
both in the absolutic path and in the Sephira of Venus, we see green, which is the note F sharp, because consistent across the board. So we have for this a smell that I have mentioned before, but you have to take it out every time you deal with air, basically, which is galbanum.
The grassy one?
The grassy one. Grassy
for
oily.
green. Oh.
Yep, whichever one. Yeah.
I like that one.
Yeah, with that sort of faint bitterness, the severity of Gevura at the end.
Or the bitter sea. Binah.
The bitter sea of Binah, yeah. And when I was designing my Libra perfume, which is called Breath of Venus, actually, because of breath, air, it's a very...
the breath of Aphrodite is delightful.
So they say. It's a sheep perfume, which is Cyprus is the island of Venus, as you know, and there's a lot of, very fragrant, resinous, pervading scent about it. Bergamot and patchouli and oak moss. It's, these are very bassy. But I did have to put in that little note of galbanum for Libra, which helped sort of cut through it just a little bit. The sword of justice, cutting through it just enough to give it some space and give it some air, which is, I guess, what its purpose is. It's a very sharp kind of smell, and its function, because you don't really want to smell galbanum alone, but its function seems to be like a spacer, to just introduce air, which I think is nice.
Like the sword.
Yes, to separate like the sword and to produce breathing room. So there you have it. Okay, so I believe that is it for Justice and Adjustment. And we are more than halfway through now, if you can believe that. We will be back next time with the Hanged Man. See you then.